Now it's working.
Oh, good. Howdy. I'm Grey Pilgrim. And I think this is working now. New battery, new card. We'll see what happens. Anyway, I want to talk about early guns. Back in the 1860s, the U.S. was going through some trying times. And in 1860, they elected Abraham Lincoln president. Well, the southern states didn't particularly appreciate that, and they basically objected. And the first thing they did is they seceded from the Union. And that means that they said, we're calling this thing quits and we're forming a thing called the Confederacy. Well, that led to some great battles. It started with them assaulting the fort at Fort Sumner. That's the name of it, and that ended up in a courthouse in Appomattox in 1865, where General Robert E. Lee and General Ulysses S. Grant sat down, and Grant accepted Lee's surrender. And about a week later, another general surrendered, and that was effectively the end of the war. Well, what's interesting about that is that 100 years later, about 1860-ish, first of all, there's a guy named Val Forget. And Val was the leader, he was the president of a company called Navy Arms. And Navy Arms was dealing in surplus stuff, ordnance, basically, from various wars, selling it as to collectors in the U.S., basically. And he looked around at the prevalence of the cowboy movies and cowboy TV shows that were popular in the late 50s and early 60s and said, hey, we got a market here. Let's start making copies of these old guns from the American Wild West. And he looked around and he couldn't find any from Colt anymore. The only ones left were, well, they were pretty well trashed out. All the ones in the movie prop houses were pretty well trashed because they've been used and abused so much by the different movie companies. So instead, he had some connections in Brixia, Italy, and he just loaded up a briefcase with a bunch of old Colts and took them there and talked to a couple of fellows and said, can you make me clones of these? And they did. Well, by 1960, 1961, in that time period, Val came up with an idea, and the idea was this. See that thing? This was a very popular gun in the early 60s. This is made by a company called Army San Marcos. Now, what's interesting about it, it looks just like a Colt. This is a Colt, 1851. Actually, this is a clone of a Colt 1851 made by Umberti, but that's another story. This is an early Colt copy with a brass frame. It's sort of a generic brass frame. It's not like any normal brass frame revolver. Now, brass frames were not considered strong enough, really, for a revolver. And this was never designed to shoot bullets at all. Why? Because in 1961, fellows were all dressing up like the North and the South and having skirmishes. ReEnactors, you know. And they'd put on shows for the tourists and go bang bang at each other at a fake battle. So what you do is you shoot blanks, which is just black powder and a wad, no ball. So these things were not meant to shoot a cartridge, a projectile. They were only meant to shoot black powder blanks. And for that, they're quite adequate. But a long service life of shooting conicals or ball is going to wear these out real quick because the brass frame will stretch over time. And when that happens, your gap gets weird, it gets loosey-goosey, and it just doesn't work right. Well, that was good enough for the early ReEnactors. But then people said, hey, you know, that's kind of cool, and we want some real things. We want things like this, only that'll shoot real bullets. So I think two companies, one was called Uberti, and the other was called, oh God, what's the name of it? Pieta. There was also 2 or 3 other big manufacturers at the time, but they just did not last out the Can't tell. Well, I think that's working again. Still keeps dying on me. Anyway, I'm saying Uberti puts their names underneath the loading lever here, whereas Pieta likes to put theirs on the side. So you can tell easily by just moving the loading lever and looking for the Uberti logo, or look on the side and see the Pieta. Army San Marcos and the other three companies that used to make these are out of business now. But they, as I said, they mainly made these brass things that were basically for reenactment. Though brass guns are still popular. Let me give you an example. During the Civil War, when a lot of the officers in the Union Army and in the Southern Army carried this, the 1851 Colt, because they got them while they were going to school at West Point, and they just go up the Connecticut Valley and go to the Colt Firearms Company and buy one of these 1851s because they needed a gun. And back then, an officer had to buy his own sidearm. Anyway, so see, here's the guys in the South. Now, there are NCOs and other people, cannon guys and all that, who didn't go to West Point. They didn't have their pistols. So what do? Well, you got to come up with something to arm them. Three companies were the real kings of doing this. There were several others in the South, but there are three in particular. The first and most famous is the Griswold and Gunnison. And this was made by Sam Griswold at his factory at Griswoldville in the South, which he built to make cotton gins and later turned into an armory for the South. But he churned out, I don't know how many of these, thousands of them during the war. And the second most common was this one, which is the Spiller and Burr. The Spiller and Burr was your typical, this one, by the way, is based on a Whitneyville pattern, sort of. It's got its own little quirks, but it's based on the Whitneyville pattern. And it's an interesting little gun. By the way, this one will shoot cap and ball just fine. The third one that was most common was the Leech and Rigdon. And the Leech and Rigdon was very much like a Colt, only the barrel, instead of being octagonal, was round. That's the main giveaway that it's a Leech and Rigdon. This one is, I think, it's by Pieta. But the problem with it is it has the scene that's engraved on the cylinder here. They used a Colt cylinder. They should have put a cylinder in the blank here because the Leech and Rigdon never had this engraving on it. But if I can, I'll go through the process of defarbing this and making it look like it's supposed to. There were others. What's this one? Oh yeah. Now this one I was going to show off. This is in 1861. The North went to this, which is the 1861 Army, and it's not 36 but 44. And they also came up. Somebody came up with this. This is a 44. Basically 1851 design. Oh, wait a minute. No, excuse me. Strike that. This is a Texas dance revolver. You'll notice that it has no bulges here. That's because to save steel, because they didn't have much steel. And I think they made this out of twisted iron, actually. They cut this off. That means a dance revolver is kind of dangerous because if a chain fires, you're going to have a lot of blasts coming back straight at you. There's nothing to block it and get in the way of the shooter's face. But different kinds of designs for different people. As I said, in 1865, about April, I think, Lee sat down with the North and signed the. If you guys know why a GoPro 7 dies on you all of a sudden, I'd be interested to know why and see how I could fix it. Anyway, when Grant sat down with Lee and Lee signed the surrender, by 1865, Jefferson Davis, the president of the South, had turned over all command to Lee because basically the civil government in the South had collapsed. And the only real center of power anymore was the Army of Northern Virginia, which was Lee's group. And Lee was the leader of that, so he was titular dictator of the South at the time. So he signed the surrender, and that was the end of the war. A lot of these guns ended up going to the Wild West because the fellows ended up with them. Well, at the surrender, you had to surrender your guns, but some people would then take the pledge of allegiance to the Union again, and then they would be allowed to pick up their arms and head back home. After all, a man who runs a farm somewhere, he's going to need some arm to protect himself from villains and predators around his farm. Now, what are you going to do with a coyote going after your chicken coop if you don't have a good old Betsy there to blast away at him, you know? It's just the nature of life in the 19th century America. They really didn't expect him to come up and take up arms against the federal government again, because it would take a leader, and there was no leader left in the South. Anyway, my point, though, is that about these early brass-framed revolvers. They were basically designed for reenactors and for shooting blanks, not for shooting balls. I have shot a ball out of that one. It works. It doesn't work well, but it does work. But I think this was my very first black powder revolver. And it got me interested in the field, but boy, leaves a lot to be desired. But it looks cool in a case. Anyway, that's all I got to talk about. Happy trails.